And since she was elected to the United States Senate in November of 2012, Senator Warren has been that fearless and relentless critic of the predatory practices of Wall Street banks, hedge fund operators, and major corporations. Friends, it is my privilege to give you the champion of America's middle class and working class families, the inspiration to us all, Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Catherine. You know, it's terrific to be here in a room full of people who value teaching and also a room full of wonks who want to talk about how we make college more affordable. This country is in trouble. We're trying to build a 21st century economy in a competitive world environment. The most basic building block of that economy is a highly educated workforce. Today, 59% of American jobs require some post-secondary education, and that number will keep on growing. But our plan to develop that workforce is faltering. There's no shortage of people hoping to get a college degree and willing to work for it. The problem is how much they'll need to pay for it. College costs are exploding. Adjusted for inflation, a student going to a state school today, now think about this, adjusted for inflation, will pay tuition that is 300% of what her mom or dad paid just 30 years ago. Now, lots of people go to college anyway, taking on huge debt loads to make it possible. In just the past year, the student loan debt has jumped another $100 billion, $100 billion in just 1 year. More than 2/3 of four-year college grads have borrowed money to get through school, with average debt loads now at about $30,000. Low and middle income families, of course, are the ones who are hit the hardest. This debt load is squeezing millions of young people and squeezing them hard. Data show that young Americans with student loan debt are putting off buying homes, saving for retirement, starting businesses. And the more people finance to pay for their educations, the more the resulting debt slows the economy. Already, the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau have sounded the alarm that mounting student debt is a real drag on economic growth. And that's why this country is in trouble. Our economy cannot flourish if we do not have enough college-educated workers, but our economy will stagnate if students take on bigger and bigger debt loads to pay for college. Degrees push us forward, but debt holds us back. The need for affordable college, colleges that offer a great education without crushing students with debt, has never been clearer. But we can't make change by just nibbling around the edges. It's time to dramatically reform higher education, to move the whole system toward greater accountability, for greater affordability for everyone. And while not every college needs to graduate every student debt-free, every kid needs a debt-free option. A strong public university where it's possible to get a great education without taking on loads of debt. It's time to open the doors of opportunity wider and to invest in our future. So, what would it take to get there? What would it take to make college more affordable and to open up debt-free options? The question takes on particular urgency as Congress begins efforts to reauthorize the Higher Education Act, rewriting the rules and regulations that define the federal role in higher education. And through this process, we have the opportunity to dramatically reform the higher education system if we can correctly identify the problems that got us here. Democrats talk about resources, pointing out that we are no longer investing in our kids the way we once did. Republicans talk about risk and incentives, arguing that students take on debt without fully understanding the consequences and that colleges get access to federal dollars pretty much no matter the quality of the education that they provide. Now, here's the truth. They're both right. And if we're going to make college truly affordable, both sides will need to acknowledge that you can't solve one without solving the other. Resources are necessary, but resources alone won't keep college costs from spiraling if incentives aren't aligned to lower those costs. And all the incentives in the world won't solve the problem if we aren't willing to invest as a nation in higher education. Our college crisis needs a 1-2 punch: more resources and better incentives to keep costs low. We know that resources matter, beginning with the Morrill Act of 1862 and the grant of federal lands to help establish what became many of the top public universities in this nation. Congress committed itself to ensuring access to an affordable education. And the states stepped up and funded those schools. The state schools also did their part. They provided a high-quality education at a low cost to students. And while some kids borrowed to go to more expensive private schools, state schools made it possible to get a diploma without drowning in debt. But those days are gone. Consider the role of state governments today. Public colleges are the backbone of our education system. More than 3/4 of college students in the U.S. are enrolled in a public college. But costs are out of sight, primarily because the states have failed to invest. In the last 25 years, average state funding per student dropped 24%. In some states, the drop has been even sharper. That leaves families to borrow to make up the difference. Federal priorities have also changed. In previous generations, Congress made strong commitments to higher education. The first GI Bill paid for education and training for 7.8 million Americans, and in so doing, transformed the lives of the greatest generation and of the nation itself. Pell Grants covered 3/4 of the cost of a public education for low-income kids. Loans under the National Defense Education Act created a generation of teachers by forgiving their debt in exchange for their work educating our children. Millions of students had the chance to attend college without getting crushed by debt. Not so today. Now Pell Grants cover only 1/3 of the costs at a public university, and the Republicans just proposed a budget to cut Pell even further. What's more, Congress treats Pell Grants primarily as discretionary spending, putting low-income families at the center of a funding fight virtually every year. Meanwhile, the student loan program has been stripped of key consumer protections and saddled with an inflated interest rate that reaps big profits for the federal government. And while the government offers loan forgiveness for public service, borrowers have to wait 10 years and jump through considerable hoops to get any relief at all. Now, resources matter, but so do incentives. And we know this because we see how colleges have changed in response to the changing government role in higher education. Instead of responding to cuts in state funding by running leaner programs focused more intensely on getting kids through school, many colleges, understanding the availability of guaranteed federal loan and grant dollars, simply pass the costs on to families through higher tuition prices. Worse, some colleges have doubled down in a competition for students that involves fancy dorms, high-end student centers, climbing walls, and lazy rivers. And they pay for those amenities with still higher tuition and fees. And colleges are running up prices in another, less visible way by keeping students on campus longer. Today, fewer than 40% of students finish a bachelor's degree in 4 years, and the extra time adds 25 to 50% more to the cost of a diploma. Marketplace incentives are so completely backwards that higher tuition is sometimes seen as a signal of higher quality. So now there's evidence that some schools are deliberately raising tuition to make themselves appear more attractive. There are so few consequences for high prices and low quality that a whole new business model now flourishes at for-profit colleges. Instead of pouring money into educational programs, or heck, even into Olympic pools and fancy climbing walls, many such colleges invest heavily in advertising, targeting young vets and single moms for programs that promise the moon and deliver nothing but heartache. When the jobs featured in the slick recruitment pitches cannot fail to materialize, students are left with mountains of debt that they cannot possibly repay. I want you to just consider 3 numbers, 10, 20, 44. About 10% of all college students are now in a for-profit college. They take in about 20% of all federal aid, and they account for about 44% of all student loan defaults. This is a serious problem. For decades, the combined efforts of colleges, of state governments, and of the federal government opened doors for millions of Americans. Sure, kids had to work hard. They had to work hard in school, pick up a summer job, maybe work part-time during school. But graduating without big debt was a real possibility for every kid in this country. That America is gone. And the question is, how do we bring it back? How do we make college affordable again? How do we put a debt-free option within reach? Well, it starts with courage. The courage of both Democrats and Republicans to admit how much is wrong and that the other side has a real point. We can make change if Republicans admit that we will never have affordable college without investing more resources in education. And if Democrats admit that we will never have affordable college without demanding real accountability in return for those investments. So let's start with the colleges. Many colleges want to keep costs low, but they face powerful incentives to attract more students, to climb in the rankings, to bring in more federal aid dollars. There is far less pressure to hold costs down or to ensure that their services are really worth the price. No matter how high tuition rises and no matter how poor the outcomes, most schools face no consequences for failing to serve their students or for wasting federal financial aid dollars. Conservatives are right. We can't keep pouring money into schools without demanding something in return. It's time for the federal government to realign incentives. And there are 3 simple ways to dramatically increase colleges' incentives to put their students first. So first, force colleges to put some skin in the game on student loans. Right now, when borrowers default on their loans, students and taxpayers pay the cost, not colleges. Remember that 44% we just talked about who couldn't pay. That means colleges reap all the benefits of the student loan funds, while students and taxpayers bear all the risk. If we want colleges to pay attention to rising costs and failing students, then the colleges need to bear some of that cost as well. There is bipartisan support for the idea of more college accountability. Senators Reid and Durbin and I have worked together on it for the last few years, and we've introduced legislation to force colleges to have some skin in the game. Conservatives at the American Enterprise Institute have endorsed similar ideas, and Senator Alexander has indicated his interest in including a risk-sharing program in the Higher Education Act. Now, if this is done right, not just window dressing, but with real and robust accountability, this could create meaningful incentives to cut costs and boost graduations. Skin in the game could also be paired with reducing overly burdensome reporting requirements and regulations, replacing them with a streamlined set of meaningful measures. Of course, the devil is in the details, and if done wrong, it will cause the accountability problem in higher education to just get worse. So we need to do it right. Second, require schools to spend a minimum proportion of their federal financial aid revenues on expenses directly related to education. Call it the rule against taxpayer waste. Taxpayers invest about $164 billion a year in colleges. That money is supposed to help support an affordable education for young people, not pay for exploding numbers of administrators or elaborate college marketing departments. If colleges want access to taxpayer money, they should commit to investing that money in affordable education for their students. And third, give colleges an incentive to cut costs by establishing shared savings. You know, when colleges help students graduate in 4 years instead of 6, for example, the students save money on tuition, and the government saves money on Pell Grants, on work study, and on other aid. If colleges can share in that savings, they will have an added incentive to keep costs down. Now, some colleges need more than a push in the right direction. Corinthian colleges, the recently closed for-profit chain, is a good example. Corinthian built its model to scoop in federal financial aid by any means necessary, including fraud. According to government investigations, Corinthian used false and misleading information to entice students to enroll, and then they left those students saddled with federal loans they could not possibly repay. For-profit colleges like Corinthian make it clear that the federal government needs to tighten the rules to keep such institutions from deceiving students and misusing federal funds. Loopholes that permit for-profit colleges to prey on veterans must be closed. When schools like Corinthian break the law, their executives shouldn't get to walk away from the mess. We need real penalties for executives at colleges that defraud their students. And Secretary of Education Arne Duncan is right when he says that for far too long, too many in Congress have protected the for-profit college industry from any real accountability. Taxpayers and students have suffered long enough. It is time to stop these abuses. Thank you. So, colleges need to do their part, but so do the states. And here are 2 policy steps that states can take that would move our students closer to affordable college and open up debt-free options. First, stop the cuts to higher education. This is simple math. Yes. As states cut back their support, tuition goes up and families have to pick up the bill. For example, since the recession, state spending per student in public colleges, 4-year public colleges in Arizona, has gone down by almost 50%. And tuition at 4-year public colleges in Arizona has gone up by about 80%. When families face higher bills and fewer are able to pay, those costs get shifted to the federal government and taxpayers through grants and loans. States are rightly proud of their public universities, and now it's time for them to back up their rhetoric with real support for their schools. And if states won't maintain minimum levels of investment in their own schools, then they shouldn't have access to federal aid to let them off the hook. We have to get serious here. Second thing states can do, refinance student loans. The federal government and private banks hold billions of dollars in student loans at 7%, 8%, 9%, 10%, even higher, even though government borrowing costs are much, much lower. My colleagues and I have tried repeatedly to create a federal refinancing option for these loans, but Republicans in the Senate have blocked our efforts every single time. With $1.3 trillion in outstanding student loan debt, our students and our economy can't wait any longer for help. Borrowers dealing with student loan debt need relief now, and the states can provide it themselves by refinancing both public and private student loan debt. You know, North Dakota recently implemented a student loan refinancing program. I hope you all know about this. They passed it under the leadership of a Republican governor with bipartisan support from the legislature. In just 8 months, the state has refinanced more than $125 million in loans, providing a break to nearly 3,000 borrowers. State refinancing programs can provide substantial benefits to in-state borrowers at no cost to state taxpayers. More states should follow North Dakota's lead, and the federal government can help them get started by clarifying the rules about using tax-exempt bond authority to refinance those loans. Okay, the colleges, the states, the federal government needs to step up too. First, leverage federal resources to make sure middle-class students have a fighting chance to make it through college without getting crushed by debt. The federal government can help states meet their responsibilities by directly partnering with them to support their colleges the same way the federal government partnered with states to build and maintain the interstate highway system. By leveraging federal dollars, we can give states an incentive to increase their investments in public education. We can bring down prices. We can improve outcomes for students. And we can make sure that every state university system in the country offers at least one path to debt-free college. Second, fix the Pell Program. This is a basic resource issue, and there's just no way around it. If low-income kids are going to have a real chance at college, then investments in Pell must increase. You know, this is one that just, how can we not do this? Pell funding should be mandatory rather than subject to yearly discretionary fights. The program's efficiency can be increased by letting students access those funds year-round, another concept that has bipartisan support, but that's where we need to be. Third, simplify the application process for federal aid. As Senator Alexander, Senator Bennett have already called for this. Financial aid doesn't mean anything if students don't apply for it. In Massachusetts, nearly 30% of college-bound students don't even fill out the FAFSA form. That means they miss out on valuable state, federal, institutional assistance. The form should be simple, limited to the fewest questions necessary to determine eligibility. And timing should be shifted so that families can figure out eligibility early enough to figure out multiple options. And fourth, change the rules of the student loan program. The federal government should not profit from student loans, period. The debate over the right interest rate should be between whether the program should break even or whether it should be subsidized, not over how big the profit should be. In addition, we could offer a service pays program that provides year-by-year loan forgiveness in exchange for public service. It would help students with their debt burdens and make college more affordable. And students who are crushed by student loan debt need better protection. When they've fallen off a financial cliff, they should be able to discharge their debts in bankruptcy. When their schools break the law and defraud them, students should also be released from their student loans. Congress gave the Department of Education the power to accomplish this, and it's long past time for the department to use this power for students who have been cheated. And one more thing. Changes to make the federal higher education rules won't work better and won't matter if the Department of Education won't enforce them. There are real reasons to worry about whether the Department of Education is committed to enforcing federal rules designed to help students. Consider what happened at Corinthian. At its peak, Corinthian had 120 campuses and enrolled more than 100,000 students. Now, federal policymakers had real concerns about Corinthian's conduct for years. They had the tools to address the conduct, but instead of acting, the Department of Education allowed Corinthian campuses to keep drawing in more and more students and sucking down more and more federal funds. When Corinthian's dangerous mix of mismanagement and deception finally blew up, the department stepped in to bail out the college and keep it alive longer. Now, Corinthian is bankrupt, and its students are scrambling to try to start over. This week, the Department of Education announced important first steps toward discharging loans for students that Corinthian defrauded. Secretary Duncan is right to help these students, and he should do more, particularly since the students were defrauded while the Department of Education passed up one opportunity after another to stop Corinthian from cheating more students. Here's one more example. Last year, the Department of Justice and the FDIC hit Navient, one of the country's largest student loan servicers, with a $100 million fine for failing to cap interest rates on both federal and private loans for members of the armed forces, caps that were required by law. Now, despite the settlement with Navient, the company continued to service millions of federal student loans. Instead of taking action against Navient, the Department of Education decided to conduct its own investigation, and a year later announced inexplicably that Navient had not engaged in misconduct. So you got to ask yourself, what's going on here? Well, last year, when Senator Harkin and I questioned the head of the student loan program at the Department of Education about why it continues to do business with Navient despite a pattern of rule breaking, the official pointed out that canceling a servicer contract would mean that the department would face the challenge of transferring millions of borrowers to a new servicer. In other words, in the view of senior officials at the Department of Education, Navient is simply too big to fail. The Department of Education needs to show that there is a real cop on the beat. Whether it's a loan servicer that's breaking the law or a college that's violating the rules of financial aid programs, the department should spell out a clear framework for how those actions will be identified, evaluated, and punished. Federal student aid should include specific consequences for rule breaking right there in the contracts with the servicers and the contracts with the debt collectors. It is time to get tough. If we expect the Department of Education to take more responsibility for enforcing the law and holding schools and servicers to high standards, then those of us in Congress need to take responsibility for holding the Department of Education accountable. That starts with transparency. Congressional oversight of the Department of Education's college programs is virtually non-existent. In the 2.5 years that I have been on the HELP committee, Department of Education officials have come in to testify about the status of our $1 trillion loan portfolio once. Data requests to the department often go unanswered for months and months at a time. The Department of Education should be required to be more transparent about its actions, from the wind down of failed colleges like Corinthian to the data it collects on the student loan program. And I'm pleased that Senator Alexander has already committed to work with me to get better data as part of the Higher Education Act reauthorization. And finally, there should be external checks on the Department of Education. One obvious example is that the student loan complaint system should be moved out of the Department of Education and over to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We don't trust a bank to handle its own complaints, and we shouldn't trust the federal student loan program to do it either. CFPB has a top-notch complaint system already in place, and federal student loan complaints could easily be added. Another obvious change is that borrowers should have a private right of action against the contractors who administer the federal loan program. When federal contractors break the rules, the students who are injured should not have to rely on a federal agency to make it right. They should be able to enforce those rules themselves in court. So, a lot of ideas, but for an important reason. This is an important moment in America, a moment at which we reconsider how to build a future. We cannot build a 21st century workforce and a 21st century economy if colleges keep raising prices, if states keep cutting support, and if the federal government squanders billions of student loan dollars on schools that do not serve students. If we drown our young people in debt, we drown America's future. Change is urgently needed. Public colleges need more resources, but they must also be accountable for lowering costs. States and the federal government cannot shirk their responsibility to keep pathways to higher education open to all, but they can and they should leverage their support to ensure that quality, affordable education is available to students and their families. Affordable college with debt-free options is not a dream. It is a very real opportunity to build a future. It begins with a commitment from Democrats and Republicans, a commitment to more resources and more accountability. This is deeply personal to me. I grew up in a family that struggled financially. Nobody thought college was in the cards for me. My daddy ended up as a janitor. My mom worked a minimum wage job at Sears. I got a scholarship. I dropped out of school. I got married at 19. And I finally made it to a commuter college that cost $50 a semester. I hung on for dear life. And that college opened a whole world for me. I worked hard, but I grew up in an America that was building opportunities for its kids. I believe in that America. I believe that we can and we must make college affordable for every hard-working kid who wants to get an education. It is up to us to make that happen. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.